This is DW News. We are streaming live from Berlin. I'm Melissa Chan, and we're here to give you the latest on the Iran war, where things stand 3 weeks into the conflict, heading into the fourth week. And we'll be speaking to two analysts, plus our correspondent in Jerusalem. Now, I have my laptop with me to keep an eye on what those in the chat via YouTube or TikTok might be saying, and I will grab any questions you might have, which I will pass on to those experts joining us. Thanks, Magic, I believe, and Ross Evans for joining the chat so far. Don't be shy. Post your questions and comments, and we will forward them to our group of experts and our correspondent. Now, a quick recap of where things stand. U.S. President Donald Trump has sent conflicting signals over what he intends to do next, as he have so many times over the past few weeks. So let's start with this soundbite. Have a listen.
Well, look, we can have dialogue, but I don't want to do a ceasefire. You know, you don't do a ceasefire when you're literally obliterating the other side. They don't have a Navy. They don't have an Air Force. They don't have any equipment. They don't have any spotters. They don't have anti-aircraft. They don't have radar. And their leaders have all been killed at every level. We're not looking to do that.
So he doesn't seek a ceasefire, but he also suggests things may be winding down, as you can see from this Truth social media post. We're going to pull that up, where he talks about, quote, winding down military efforts because he claims of the deep degradation of Iranian military capabilities. And then he goes on to say, quote, the Hormuz Strait will have to be guarded and policed as necessary by other nations who use it. Now, that might be news to these other nations. The American president seems to believe he can just walk away from the conflict if he wants to, but can he really do that? So, without further ado, we're going to bring in William Alberque, who's a former NATO official and now a senior fellow with the Pacific Forum, which is a think tank based in Honolulu. And later, in a few minutes later, we will have Sara Kermanian of the International Relations Department at the University of Sussex. But first, William. William, welcome. You've spoken to DW News quite a number of times over the past few weeks. What do you make of Trump's soundbite just now, and then his post about a wind down?
I think there's a real dichotomy within the U.S. government as to exactly what the war aims are in this conflict with Iran. Do they want complete regime change, as in a government that's acceptable to the United States, or do they want to just degrade Iranian's military capabilities, especially its missile capabilities? Are we going to go after the nuclear, highly enriched uranium, 440.9 kilograms of which is still unaccounted for? So I think the shifting war aims, plus the market pressure, the huge spike in oil prices, which is going to drive inflation, which is going to raise the price of everything. Even though Trump has said we don't need Iranian oil, it does mean that the oil prices are spiking, and that will have effects. And I think Trump is incredibly sensitive to those sort of market shifts, which could have a huge effect on the midterm elections in the United States.
Now, William, I think one of the reasons, if I can say so, as a former correspondent who's based in the United States as well, is that there's a lot of infighting within the White House. So the president seems to be changing his mind in part because of that infighting. Do we have a sense, for example, of where Vice President J.D. Vance stands in relation to National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and so on?
Well, you hate to psychoanalyze people from afar, but just based on their past positions, you would say that J.D. Vance was very much against further engagements in the Middle East and the so-called forever wars. On the other hand, Rubio has been much more of a classic Republican neocon, willing to take U.S. interests overseas, and engage in conflicts where necessary. And then Hegseth just seems to like to blow stuff up. It's really difficult to discern any sort of longer term strategy from that fella. But I would say that you're right, that within the MAGA movement, there is this very strong group fed by Trump's promises not to engage in forever wars, not to get mixed up in the Middle East, versus those who really do want to use U.S. power, want to build up so much U.S. power, and wield that anywhere in the world, anytime we feel like it. And those two groups are really tearing each other apart. I mean, you can see sort of the internecine warfare within the MAGA movement between those who support this war and those who wonder why in the world we're fighting it. It's very interesting. We'll see how that plays out politically on the bigger stage.
And I want to welcome others in the chat who are posting, Green, Jerry, and Dave. Thank you very much. I'm going to keep asking William a few questions, and then we'll look at your comments and questions that you provide. Now, William, meanwhile, in the last few hours, Iran says there has been a U.S.-Israeli attack on its Natanz uranium enrichment facility. Israel, just in the last hour or so, has said it was not aware of this attack. Now, you're a nuclear non-proliferation expert. What does this latest attack mean? And long-term, are Iran's nuclear capabilities set back?
So, Iran had the ability to enrich uranium at 3 sites. One was at a place called Fordo, and then 2 sites within Natanz, one on the surface and one deeply buried. We're pretty sure that those facilities have all been hit very, very hard and knocked out of operation. However, Iran was building a 3rd facility at Natanz just to the southwest of the other 2 facilities. And we saw work on tunnels before the June strikes last year. And we've seen some work happening in between June and this most recent outbreak of conflict. So it may be that they're striking that facility. But I am surprised because I don't think there's really any capabilities there. There may be some storage for centrifuges in some of the tunnel complexes. But really the prize is, as I mentioned before, the highly enriched uranium, which we believe is stored underground at Esfahan and may have been buried in the rubble there. Now, it may be that some of the uranium is still at Natanz or Fordo, and maybe they're trying to destroy that in place rather than to try to risk a ground operation to go in and seize the material. But it's still very unclear. Yeah, so there is a substantial amount of 60% enriched, highly enriched uranium in gaseous form in these big metal containers in Iran, and getting them, accounting for them, or destroying them will be a key war aim. Trump may be wanting to finish that so he can declare some sort of victory.
William, just for those who might not understand, including myself, frankly, the science behind this, to what extent can you bomb to the point of trying to get rid of this uranium? I mean, isn't that dangerous? Could that set off a chain reaction? I think there's a lot of questions around the safety of that strategy.
Yeah, so these are just basically large metal tanks that contain uranium hexafluoride gas that has been enriched. So it's been enriched up to 60%. You would then have to take that gas and turn it into a solid form, and turn that solid form into metal so that you could make a metal pit that would be the center of a bomb. And you'd need, for highly enriched uranium, somewhere around 20, 25 kilograms of 90% enriched uranium. And so this stuff is dangerous. It is close to bomb-making quality, but it is not in and of itself dangerous. I mean, if one of these tanks exploded in the room here, I'd be dead. But if I were a block away, I would be fine. The amount of potential radiation release from destroying these metal containers filled with uranium gas is very low. Again, it's toxic to breathe in, but it's not going to have huge radiation effects. And it's also uranium. So uranium emits alpha particles, which can be stopped by clothing. This isn't like a Chernobyl scenario. This is more like, a temporary gaseous release that would be dangerous for people on site, but nowhere else. So there's no real danger of any kind of fissile explosion or any kind of radiation release that you would be able to detect from far off site.
So absent boots on the ground, this is the best alternative as a strategy?
It's rough because even from the air, you're still going to have a very tough time of knowing whether you've destroyed all of these containers, because we're talking about dozens and dozens of these containers, and I would be loath to try to be able to tell whether or not we had hit them, considering they're buried probably under tons of dirt and concrete right now. So they may just want to pound the facilities a lot so they have some higher confidence that it's been destroyed. But yeah, boots on the ground are really the only way, which is why the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has been begging Iran for some kind of idea of the condition of these tanks and some sort of access so that they can account for them. And absent that, yeah, there's going to be a real question, no matter how much bombing you do, as to whether you've destroyed it all or not.
I mean, I think the big question, and one it will be difficult to say, but given the conflict over the past 3 weeks, there's very little incentive for Tehran to not want to pursue nuclear weapons outright after this, whenever this ends, correct?
It's a big question, because you would have to say, from the Iranian government's point of view, first of all, the steps they took towards a bomb, and we do not know if Iran has actually ever made the decision to build nuclear weapons. They've taken steps in that regard. They've designed a program and they've taken steps towards a bomb, but it does not appear that they actually made the decision to build an individual bomb or multiple bombs. So in the wake of this conflict, where they were hedging by going closer and closer on that spectrum towards bomb making, if they would bet that the best way to safety would be to build one, I think that would be a terrible bet. In fact, it's these steps they've taken that they thought would increase their security, or at least increase their leverage in negotiations, that gave Israel the excuse to bomb Iran in the first place back last year, and has been one of the stated war aims this year. So I think if Iran decided to race towards a bomb now, that would be the one way to guarantee U.S. troops on the ground in Iran. That would be the one way to guarantee a campaign even worse than the one that we're seeing now in terms of lethality for Iran. So I would hope they would not make that bet, because I think they've lost the bet so far, and they will go on losing that bet if they continue down this path. And it's not like a nuclear weapon would have magical safety effects for Iran. It wouldn't be a magic shield. Right. Remember, Iran and Israel have been exchanging missiles for a long time. And if Israel, with a nuclear arsenal, can be attacked by Iran, then why would Iran think that one nuclear weapon is somehow going to make it safe?
William, I want to pivot, but I want to apologize to folks who are posting in chat. We are aware that there are technical issues with the YouTube live stream, a little bit glitchy, just in terms of us coming across as pixelated faces. Unfortunately, I'm looking at the computer myself, and it's not looking great. But hopefully, there goes the latency issue. But we're working on that, and hopefully, you'll be able to hear the rest of this conversation pretty clearly. Now, William, the other interesting development are these U.S. media reports of Iran launching ballistic missiles at the joint U.S.-UK base on the island of Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean. We're going to try to pull up a map to show you just how far away it is from Iran. Now, this island, Diego Garcia, is part of the Chagos Islands. And this missile attack is based on information from U.S. media reports, getting information from U.S. officials. And the reports also suggest that the missiles have missed. There's been no confirmation from Iran about this. I'm curious about your take about this, frankly, this new development, if that is the case, because this conflict is growing farther and farther. I remember in the first week, there was the attack on the Iranian ship close to the coast of Sri Lanka. This is not just a Middle East conflict.
Right. So, the Chagos Islands are about 4,000 kilometers from Iran. And it does appear that Iran have launched 2 missiles, according to the Wall Street Journal reporting, 2 missiles fired at the Chagos Islands, and one of them apparently broke up on its own, and the report is the U.S. fired missile defense system at that missile. There's no word as to whether it intercepted it or it, again, fell apart on its own. What this looks like is more of a symbolic attack than anything else. It is possible that they've taken one of their really longer range missiles that we thought had a range limit of about 2,000 kilometers, like the Khorram Shahar 4, and it carries like a 1-ton payload. So if you eliminated the payload entirely or reduced it to just a very small symbolic amount of explosives, that would extend the range. But these are going to be incredibly inaccurate. incredibly unreliable. And this is much more of a symbolic gesture. And the fact that neither of them reached Diego Garcia just demonstrates that what I think Iran is trying to do is to sort of shock the United States, to put in a strategic shock. That's why they've been, saving missiles and dosing, small amounts of missiles every day, and trying to find ways to, to destabilize the situation and to do something asymmetric. But it really does appear that this was, sort of a one-off attack to try to shock the West rather than to have a real military effect. And of course, I mean, the message that it sends is if Iran had missiles that could range 4,000 kilometers, then that puts a lot of Europe under the Iranian missile threat. That was one reason why the previous Ayatollah had limited Iran's missiles to 2,000 kilometers in range. And that was a self-limiting promise, so it's not a binding promise. And this may just be demonstrating, that the old Khomeini is dead and the gloves are off and all that kind of stuff. But we still assess that Iran's current missile arsenal can't really go effectively much beyond 2,500, 3,000 kilometers. So again, this is more of a political gesture or a shock gesture rather than a military capability that puts a place like Diego Garcia or mainland Europe under threat.
Yeah, and you talk about political gesture, but of course also Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia, is also part of a complicated dispute, right? Because the base belongs to the UK, but the UK has been in the process of transferring sovereignty of that territory to the country of Mauritius, and that transfer has been criticized by Trump as well. So it's a little messy of a situation and puts the UK in a difficult situation as well with this development. Now, I do want to bring in Sara Kermanian of the International Relations Department at the University of Sussex in the UK. Sara, thank you for your patience and welcome to DW News.
Thank you for having me.
I want to let's just move into talking about what's happening internally in Iran. And William is still going to be here. So William, please do also join into and stay with this conversation. Sara, there seems to be the contours of some kind of war strategy from Iran. They appear to be sort of focused on degrading U.S. capabilities, hitting missile bases, military bases, and in an effort to continue to also remind the Gulf states of the cost of its relations with the U.S. It has even struck non-military targets there. Do you think that reflects at least a semblance of a core leadership in the country, that it has some kind of control? Because in the early days, it looks and it felt as if Iran was just hitting whatever it could.
Well, it kind of shows, as some of the internal experts have talked about it, a core leadership when it was designed, when the war strategy was designed at the time that Khamenei was not yet dead, that is still in place, and that is how the rest of the IRGC seems to be following his lead. At the moment, it seems that this is the probably most accurate guess one can make, that mostly the leadership of the war in the country is in the hand of a group of IRGC generals. They're not high-rank generals because most of them are dead, but it is IRGC generals that are basically following a predetermined strategy, which is very, very obvious. It's just asymmetric war strategy. It's very clear what they are doing. And they're following that. In order to understand how the Islamic Republic really operates, we need to realize that it is not really a status political structure. It's just based on a vertical division of power. This is something that the United States was well aware of, and they were worried about this war that they are putting themselves into, because this is the distribution of kind of connections and lines of loyalty is quite decentralized. It's not just even horizontal. It's very decentralized. It's based on ideological alliances. So even though the leader is dead, and even though some kind of frictions were kind of beginning to show themselves in the first days, still it seems that the core of IRGC leadership, which is still there, they are following the strategy that was previously designed. And yes, as you said, it is an asymmetric war strategy.
And do you have any sense, and I know that this has just happened fairly recently, but with U.S. President Donald Trump saying that he's considering winding down operations, do you have a sense of how Tehran and the leadership there might be thinking about that? Do they also welcome a wind down? But of course, as always in war, it's not just the United States that has a vote in this. Other countries involved in this conflict have a vote. What is your sense of what Iran wants to do? Would it try to continue this fighting just to make it more painful for the United States and for the Gulf countries so that they don't try to attack Iran ever again?
Well, Araqchi said that we don't want a ceasefire. We want an end to this war. And what is an end to this war? It's probably like the U.S. coming into some sort of agreement with the United States, sanctions being removed, because as long as the sanctions are there, then basically they are there for a reason. So this conflict could be escalated ever again in the future. And they can see that because of course, the U.S. has upper hand militarily, but because it's lower threshold of basically the cost it is paying in this war is much higher than the Islamic Republic, which has higher resilience because they're fighting for their survival. So of course, now that the war has started, they would prefer to inflict as much cost as possible on the United States, as you just said. But something that is important in what Trump had suggested is that he conditioned that winding down of the attacks on basically an agreement that would transfer the control of the Strait of Hormuz to other states in the region. And Iran is not going to really accept it like easily. Of course, they're going to, even if that control of the Strait of Hormuz is transferred to, or Trump supports other Gulf states to control the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is going to probably start continue retaliation attacks on their territory. So this can actually lead to other forms of escalation in the region, but I don't think it actually could be winded down easily as Trump wanted. Trump has put himself really in a war that he's looking for an exit, but unfortunately that exit cannot really come as easily as he wants it to be.
Okay, this is a question for both Sara and William. Speaking of the region, let's pull out a bit more because more and more countries might be drawn into this war, as you say, even as Trump talks about winding down operations. I want to just quickly give a shout out. A lot more comments in the chat, but Tommy Dancing Tommy says, elect a clown and get a circus. Presumably, Tommy, you're referring to the U.S. president based on the chat and what everyone else is talking about. Now, there were reports during the first week of this conflict that Saudi Arabia had privately egged President Trump on to take military action. Now it might be a case of buyer's remorse for Riyadh, with Iran attacking the country daily. Let's talk about the point at which Riyadh might finally escalate its response in this context, or if Riyadh wants to avoid this escalating at all costs. Let's go to William first, and then we'll go to Sara for your thoughts on that.
Well, yes, the Gulf states have always been a little bit miffed by the U.S. approach to say it's about the nuclear program, because for the states in the Gulf region, it's about Iran's support for proxy wars, for the Houthis in Yemen, for the Hezbollah and for Hamas, their strategy of pushing revolution across the region, and the idea that we were talking before about the limit on Iranian missiles, 2,000 kilometers. Well, that's great for Europeans, but that's terrible if you live in the Gulf. And so there was some pressure from the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, for the United States to take a tougher stance on Iran. And I can believe that they were quietly supportive of action, as long as it was very effective and targeted and didn't have long-lasting impact on Saudi Arabia itself. In the meantime, Iran has been learning from the use of its own drones in Ukraine on how to overwhelm better air defenses. And now, we're seeing the occasional missile towards Saudi Arabia's oil production capabilities. We're seeing drones, etc. I do think there is a tipping point where if Iran continues to target Saudi energy infrastructure, or even to go after a civilian population, where Saudi Arabia might consider some sort of kinetic action. But I think it's very careful in this regard, because for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, they do have to live with Iran no matter what. And so engaging just in open warfare without an idea of exactly what the U.S. war plan and the war aims, and as you guys were just talking about, what war termination looks like, it would be really bad for Saudi Arabia to join in now and then have the United States try to stop conflict, declare a ceasefire, down tools, whatever, and then have Saudi Arabia exposed as a target for further Iranian retaliation. So it's a very complex game right now. And I think all the Gulf states are just really watching carefully, trying to defend themselves against missiles and drones, but not wanting to engage unless they absolutely have to.
Sara, do you agree with William?
Well, I agree that they're very careful about that. They're very cautious. I think something that we need to pay more attention to is that I think many states were undermining resilience of the Islamic Republic. Many were hoping that once Khamenei is dead, then maybe another something, and not just regional states, but also within Iran, the opposition groups. Many were undermining the resilience of the Islamic Republic. So they were hoping maybe initially when they were encouraging the United States to maybe go harder on Iran. They were hoping that with a targeted attack, Iran is going to become weak. And this is something, a weak Iran is something that would benefit most states in the region. But they were not maybe foreseeing the price Iran was willing to pay for preserving not just its survival, but also to prove that it has still the power to inflict costs on regional powers. I think at the moment, the Saudi and basically all the Gulf states, they are avoiding, as much as they can, they are avoiding getting into this war actively and directly. It is very obvious. But two things are complicating this situation. One is that if Houthis start making the Red Sea insecure, because Bab al-Mandab is now basically the main oil transport route for Saudi, with the Strait of Hormuz being almost closed for the past few weeks. So basically, that can bring the conflicts maybe to a whole new scale. Another issue, another kind of autoimmunity issue that the situation has for the Saudi is that any sort of starting and a direct war on Iran would require a military coalition of the Islamic states, which Israel would see we wouldn't really see favorably. Recently, Naftali Bennett in a tweet basically was threatening Turkey that if they try to start moving into creating any sort of Islamic coalition, Islamic military coalition, and basically I think this was not just a threat to Turkey, but also was addressing the entire region, that any effort for creating Islamic military coalitions is going to turn those countries potentially next targets maybe for Israel, and is going to escalate tensions further. So if they want to enter in a sort of war, they would need to create coalitions, right. And that coalition is going to bring in with it new retaliations and new conflicts.
I want to ask you about a country that is very concerned about possibly being dragged into the war, and that is the country of Iraq. The country has become more volatile. The latest is that Baghdad's National Intelligence Office was hit by a drone. The country has a history of sectarian violence, and of course you have Iran-backed Iraqi paramilitaries that have launched drones against U.S. troops there. And also, I know that there are supporters of Iran among its majority Shia Muslim population. Is it possible things might escalate there, Sara?
I think this war has opened some sort of a Pandora box. Many front lines are going to be opened potentially between Shia militant groups and also basically Shia people who are not really happy with the situation and their enemies. And Iraq is the first country to be affected by that. This is one of the reasons, and as you just mentioned that. So Iraq has already been affected by the war. At least we can say that the war has been extended into the territory of the state of Iraq in two different ways. One is through these supporters of Iran, the militant groups, and another way is Iran has been attacking Kurdish militant and non-militant sites of the Iranian Kurdish parties inside the territory of the Kurdish region of Iraq. So already the state of Iraq is being affected by the war, really. And yes, if the tensions escalate, more front lines are going to be opened up between different forces, because, yeah, as you said, it basically reflects many opposition groups that exist within Iran. Many kind of fractions of power have their representatives in a way inside Iraq, so it can easily turn into another front line of war and contestations.
I want to pursue a bit more about this. I want to talk about the Kurdish role for Sara, but William, I want to check in with you and see if you have anything to add to what Sara just said. Otherwise, I'll move on to my next question. William?
No, that's fine. I think she's got it perfectly.
Okay, so Sara, there are diverse Kurdish populations, not just in Iran, but also Iraq, Turkey, and even Syria. What do we know about the dynamics among the Kurds and how keen any of them might be to fight yet again after being burned by the Americans a number of times over the past few decades? Sara, I know this is something that you specially focus on.
Well, yeah, but this is a very complicated, really, topic and question because it's just because the Kurdish territory is being divided among 4 nation states. So the dynamic, you can just imagine how complicated it is. I think at the moment the Kurds are already being attacked a lot, and they have been. When you think about it, Iran has been attacking, as I said, these Kurdish bases inside the territory of the Kurdish region of Iraq since the beginning of the war. And already what was referred to as a news leakage by CNN claiming that that the U.S. is planning to turn the Kurds into their boots on the ground, a claim that later was denied, basically both by Trump and by the Kurdish parties, that no such arrangement has been made. But already that put them under extra security kind of measures and made them even easier targets for the Islamic Republic. So they already have been really paying a high price for a war in which they are not even taking any role yet. And they have made it clear as much as possible that this is not their war. But we also need to pay attention to the fact that if the situation moves towards a civil war kind of situation, towards pushing Iran to the point of becoming a failed state, which I think is Israel's strategy at the moment, then they would also need to step in. They would need to think about their own self-defense. It seems that what the parties are at the moment prioritizing is to make sure that they are preserving their forces for self-defense if it is needed, and if a time that comes that it is needed, while also trying to kind of make actions that is in accordance with what is happening elsewhere in the region. It is an opportunity. They have, as part of the right to self-determination, they might have negotiations with any state, but it seems that they are very logically prioritizing their own survival and self-defense.
Got it. Thank you very much. I think I'll leave it there with both Sara Kermanian and William Alberque. Thank you very much, the both of you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
We're going to pull in DW's Jerusalem correspondent, Emily Gordine. Thank you very much, Emily, for your patience. And in case you're just joining us, we are talking about, well, of course, the latest that we have on this conflict over the past 3 weeks, with the latest headline saying that Trump is mulling a winding down of the war and saying that other nations should guard the Strait of Hormuz. But Emily, over to you in Jerusalem. Israel has launched missiles and have received its fair share in return over the past few weeks. And on Friday, police said shrapnel fell near holy sites where you are now in Jerusalem's Old City. What can you tell us about what happened?
That's right. Now, what you need to understand about the situation here, when Iran launches missiles, especially at central Israel, they come from that direction and they fly over Jerusalem. And this is where a lot of them are intercepted. And so when they are intercepted, a lot of the shrapnel lands here. And we've seen that over the last few weeks, that shrapnel has landed all across Jerusalem, in the streets, in the houses, sometimes damaging roofs and cars. But what was unusual yesterday, where we saw an extensive set of barrages across the country, is that one of the fragments of the intercepted missiles hit the walls of the old city that you see behind me. The missile fragment hit close to the Temple Mount that is most prominently visible here through the Golden Dome of Rock. And of course, this is a holy site to Christians, Muslims, to Jews as well. And of course, that causes concern. But that being said, at the moment, the Israeli authorities have closed the Al-Aqsa compound. They have also closed the Holy Sepulchre Church at the Western Wall, where Jewish worshippers usually gather to pray. They are allowed to gather at the Western Wall, but only in small numbers, 50 people at a time, according to the Home Front Command security rules at the moment. So fewer people around, but it was, of course, a shocking image for the people who live here and to worshippers and the religious people of this country who hold this site sanctimonious, holy.
Now, the U.S. and Israel continue to target security infrastructure in Iran in this attempt to undermine the state's internal control. Emily, any sense whether that is working?
we did hear from Benjamin Netanyahu that, according to him, according to his security and intelligence information, cracks, quote, are starting to show in the Iranian regime. Now, what we're seeing play out in Iran is essentially the same blueprint that the Israelis applied in Gaza and in what they're applying in Lebanon right now, where the aim is to take out the head of the operation there, the head of Hamas, the head of the leadership of Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's exactly what we're seeing in Iran right now. It started with the killing of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and continued throughout. The question is just whether that is really going to work. In Gaza, what we're seeing at the moment, just to give you an idea, Hamas is, reports at least suggest that they have been re-establishing their authority, their power, their control over the Gaza Strip. In Lebanon, it's unclear what the outcome of this operation is going to be, but Iran is a whole different ballpark, really. We're talking different dimensions. It's a huge country, a huge security apparatus, and experts certainly are not convinced that an air operation alone will evoke regime change in Iran.
Now, Emily, even as the U.S. and Israel work together firing on targets, the long-term goals of the two countries appear increasingly divergent. How big a conversation is that among the Israeli public?
Well, the Israeli public at this point is mostly concerned with, well, first of all, the Israeli public supports this war. They know that the Americans are their most important allies. They are vital. But the Israelis are mostly concerned about the day after. What is the plan? What is the strategy going forward? For the Israelis, it's important to destroy Iran's nuclear program, to destroy or at least mitigate the nuclear program. Same goes for the ballistic missile program. Preferably, they would also like to see regime change. But when you look at the Trump administration, you've seen mixed messaging throughout this war. So it is unclear, even though both sides continue to reiterate that they are on the same side, they're on the same page, they pursue the same strategy. But what's coming out of the mouths of those two leaders is somewhat divergent. And it's really unclear to analysts, observers, journalists like myself, where the two sides are really going with this operation.
Emily Gordine, thank you very much for joining us in Jerusalem. I want to thank everyone who's been posting comments and questions. Some of your questions are related to oil and energy. That is something that I think our expert, if we had an expert on oil and energy for this live stream, would have been able to answer. But I wanted to explain that I am seeing those questions. The experts that we had today were international relations specialists. But shout out to Christy, Leonidas, HC, and Casper for joining in to the chat. Why don't we have a recap of some of the most important developments in this regional conflict just to round things out? U.S. President Donald Trump has said on social media that the U.S. is considering, quote, winding down its military operation in the Middle East, even as U.S. officials confirm more troops are being deployed to the region, something we've been talking about over the last 40 minutes. U.S. media are reporting that Iran fired 2 ballistic missiles at the UK-U.S. joint military base on the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, but neither of them struck the base, according to an official. If you want to find out more, you can actually look and scroll earlier to the earlier part of our live stream. About 10 minutes in, we start talking about Diego Garcia. And finally, Iran says its Natanz nuclear facility has been hit in an airstrike. The International Atomic Energy Agency said that there has not been an increase in off-site radiation levels. So there you have it, and that's it for this live stream. As always, check our YouTube and TikTok, our tab, the live tab, and you will see when the next live stream is up. Thanks again for joining us, and as usual, our social media handles at DW News. Thank you very much. I'm Melissa Chan.